told you off the top, the FBI is warning of possible armed protests at all 50 state capitals in the coming days leading up to Biden's inauguration. In fact, this warning initially went out before last week's raid on the Capitol building. Groups behind the protests are spread out throughout the country, including right here in San Diego County. And to learn more about those local groups, we are joined by Joel Day, a professor of public policy at UC San Diego. Joel, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Jim. Nice to be with you.
So what kind of groups do we have here in San Diego County?
Well, we've got to grapple with our region's history of reactionary fascism, from the KKK and their roots out in East County to anti-immigrant militias that we've seen over time. That's really developed into three different strains of extremism here. We've got the political seditionists like Combat 18 and the Sovereign Citizen movement. We have right-wing paramilitary movements. There's a group here called the 3%ers, which are about 3% of the population overthrowing the United States. And then thirdly, there's these hate and white supremacy groups, RAM, Identity Europa, the Proud Boys. And these are groups that are actively trying to use violence, premeditated violence, against civilians for a political purpose, which is the textbook definition of terrorism.
Are these the groups that made up the raid on the Capitol and that we're anticipating are going to be protesting at state capitals? Because from what I can see, they don't see themselves as necessarily those kinds of groups. They see themselves as saving America.
Right. So over the last couple of years, what we've really seen, even here locally, is that those three types of groups have embedded themselves and begun to start radicalizing our neighbors in more mainstream groups, people like Ashley Babbitt, people that are part of, say, Defend East County, or even part of the pro-Trump movement. They've been radicalized using the language of victimization and belonging with these groups, so that the tentacles of these groups have spread out into things like the Reopen protests. We know for a fact that the Reopen protests over the summer were spearheaded by somebody who is part of a paramilitary group who trains to overthrow the government of the United States. So unwittingly, folks are being radicalized, and we've got to do something about that.
We know that state capitals are preparing right now. What should local governments be doing to deal with groups like this?
Well, there's kind of three different approaches that I think that we need to follow here locally. Our city council has a responsibility to take this very seriously. The first thing that I would suggest is that we need to fully fund staff positions, perhaps in the new Office of Race and Equity, perhaps within the mayor's office directly, that can have a full-time job of working with the Anti-Defamation League, working with Department of Homeland Security or the Southern Poverty Law Center, that tracks these groups to understand how they're operating in San Diego. They can work with victims and targets of these groups, such as here where I live over in the Convoy district, that has been a significant target of hate and anti-immigrant hate after President Trump called it the quote-unquote China virus. We can work with those victims at a city level in order to support them better. We can create a hotline where friends and family and coworkers might say, you know what, this person's acting increasingly deranged as it comes to seditionist language, hateful language. They're wearing Nazi paraphernalia. How do I interact with this person to get them to step back from the ledge? And finally, this staff level person should be working with the city attorney's office, the district attorney's office, on issuing gun restraining orders through a judge, through these red flag laws, to make sure that radicals aren't getting guns on our city streets. That's something that we can do. The next section of what city council can help do is grapple with the insurrection and seditionists that are perhaps embedded within local law enforcement. We know that the FBI has issued a warning that there are quote unquote active links between domestic terror groups and local law enforcement. And so as city council is writing the law for the new police commission, it has to be part of the power for the Civilian Review Board to investigate officer membership in domestic terror groups, to ensure that our police forces, our tax dollars, our neighbors are protected in the best way possible. And finally, I think it's critically important that we take a stand by joining international groups that work on anti-hate. We are the 7th city to join what's called the Strong Cities Network. We need somebody to work on that network, learning from other groups around the world about how to combat deadly violent extremism. And we should join things like the Mayor's Compact against hate and bigotry and violence to take a stand and say that that's not going to be allowed here in San Diego.
Well, on the note of working on anti-hate, I think that is something that most everyone can agree on. Talking to Joel Day, professor of public policy at UC San Diego. Joel, thanks for your time today.
Thanks, Jim.